Thinking about this month's theme of pluralism, the title of this sermon was inspired by something I witnessed in protests against police brutality. It's an organizing technique called the human microphone or the people's microphone. It's a way of delivering a speech or instructions to a large group of people when amplification is not allowed or available. The speaker begins by saying the words "mic check." When the people near the speaker hear that, they respond "mic check." And the speaker knows that this group has heard and gotten their attention. The speaker then says in short phrases part of a speech and then pauses. Those who can hear what the speaker has said repeat that phrase loudly in unison so that a much wider circle can hear the information. When finished, the speaker says another phrase, then pauses for it to be repeated, and so on until the speaker is finished. I learned this week that the technique was started in 1999 at the WTO protests in Seattle. It became a lot more common during the Occupy Wall Street movement. It flourished there. This was interesting because New York had regulations prohibiting the use of megaphones. Necessity is the mother of invention, they say. And so began another useful tool of community organizing. Sometimes, too many times, people have to get creative to have their message heard. I hope that we as a faith community that calls for pluralism will be part of amplifying the voices of those who have been silenced for too long. I hope that we recognize our power and use our power to bring critical information from the margins to the center of every conversation. Speaking of protests, in mid-October this year, several of you were there with me, we attended the Capistrano Unified School Board meeting. I actually had the opportunity to speak briefly only because I dragged Liz up there with me in an aggressive way to get in line for public comments. There were way too many people to speak than the board would allow. But to be fair, it was already a very late night. They couldn't possibly have accommodated all of the speakers who wanted to speak on the issue. The issue that brought such a crowd was a proposed policy that would require teachers and other staff to inform parents if a student requested to use gender pronouns other than what was assigned to them at birth. It forced school employees to out transgender students to their parents, with zero consideration of who those parents were. The policy was written by the national right-wing organization Moms for Liberty. The policy is written in intentionally ambiguous ways, talking about a wide array of mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, suicidality, and other things. In some instances, the transgender identity is specifically named as one of those issues. This policy that we were talking about did not specifically identify it, but at the meeting, the board member who introduced the policy said that yes, indeed, this was what she was talking about. The night of the meeting was very intense. Hundreds of people were listening outside because the seats in the chamber had already been filled hours before with the people that got there early. As the issue came up for debate in the meeting, something magical happened. This particular school district had an amazing policy of allowing students to speak first on any issue that came before them. And so, around 7 students spoke in favor of the policy, and around 50 students, many of whom identified as queer, spoke against it. They spoke from their own experience of being queer in South Orange County, They spoke clearly about the general consensus of mental health professionals who understand that sexual orientation and gender identity are not indications of mental disorders. They told stories of friends who were not safe in their own homes, and they pleaded with the school board to not remove school as one of the places where they could be safe being their authentic selves. They were amazing. Then non-students were allowed to speak in the remaining time. In an attempt to be fair, they had speakers from alternating between for and against the measure. Probably half of those who supported the policy urged the school board not to listen to these students, claiming they're only kids. What do they know? The evening concluded with a victory for queer student safety. While we succeeded in defeating the forced outing policy in Capistrano Unified, the same policy has already been passed at Orange Unified District and others throughout the state. And it will keep popping up at school boards and will very likely be a statewide ballot initiative. I wanted to tell this story for one, as a reminder that our LGBT community is again in the crosshairs of the culture war. But more importantly, for today's conversation, I think that it's a great demonstration of why we must listen to the people who are most impacted by the question at hand. It's easy and more satisfying to be angry or to dismiss them as hateful homophobes. But I do believe that the Moms for Liberty and others there that night do care about young people. They're just wildly misguided in their effort. And it is very tempting to think that we know what is best for other people. I include myself in this observation. We tend to be people with big opinions. Some of us have accumulated graduate degrees. Many of us have parented. It's very tempting to think that we know what is best for others. In the 1990s, the disabilities rights movement in South Africa coined the phrase, "nothing about us without us." It is a tremendous guiding light in justice struggles. Nothing about us without us. It doesn't mean that we get to just sit out and take a pass because there's not someone there to give us instructions. But it does mean that as allies to any marginalized group, our efforts are a constant dance between listening and acting boldly. That's not easy, but rest assured, we are practiced at sharing the microphone in our faith tradition. The fifth principle of our UUA says that we covenant to affirm and promote the use of the democratic process and the right of conscience in our congregations and in society at large. People tend to forget principles 2 through 6, but there's some good stuff in there. In the proposed revision of our principles, pluralism is specifically lifted up as one of our core values. And here at Tapestry, each Sunday morning, we covenant to seek the truth in love together. All of those documents and affirmations reflect that we have baked in this assumption that there will be diverse, even dissenting views of what is true and good. We actively encourage skepticism and diversity of thought. That's not true of every religious tradition. Last month, for our ministers' reading group, several of us read John Buren's book, Universalists and Unitarians in America, A People's History. It is not a page-turner, but it is informative. all of us learned about some of the less famous but really remarkable people who laid the foundation for our faith tradition. People who moved their local community and our country toward greater freedoms. For me, the most inspiring thing that came up in this book was, as I read, starting in the mid-1700s, decade after decade, I thought, yes, these are our people. This is our culture. We have been loving, disagreeing with one another, and changing the world around us for a very long time. That shouldn't be a surprise, I suppose. Our tradition is rooted in two heretical theologies, two ideas that other Christians considered blasphemous at the time. Unitarianism was a rejection of the Trinity. Universalism was a rejection of the Calvinist predestination that shaped American Christianity for hundreds of years. Our forebearers were heretics, disagreeing boldly. I was interested to learn in this book of the one-time Universalist minister, Reverend Abner Kneeland, was arrested for blasphemy in 1833. He was the last person indicted for the crime of blasphemy in the United States. And the prosecutor in the case was a Unitarian. To be fair, Abner Kneeland held some radical views for 1833. He supported equal rights for women and equality of the races. He suggested that women keep their own names and bank accounts. He spoke out in favor of birth control, divorce, and interracial marriage. His theology included ultra-universalism, immediate salvation after death. And a piece of theology that may resonate with more of us today, he believed that God and nature are synonymous, writing, "I'm not an atheist, but a panentheist. That is, instead of believing there is no God, I believe that in the abstract all is God. It is in God we live, move, and have our being." His blasphemy trial took on 3 appeals, invoking letters of petition from all of Boston's intellectual leaders, both supporting and condemning him. Abner Kneeland was a minor figure in our proud history of heretics, blasphemers, and radicals. If our UU communities seem a little prone to disagreement, it's because we always have been. And hopefully, we will always invite a diversity of ideas. Embracing pluralism also means embracing disagreement, change, and growth. Our embrace of different ideas between different peoples echoes the understanding that in our own selves there are multiple layers of belief. And we grow and change over time, or at least we hope we grow and change over time. Ralph Waldo Emerson famously wrote, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by statesmen and philosophers and divines." Let us not be constrained by a foolish consistency. A practical faith invites us to draw on a variety of resources. At different times and in different ways, each of us finds hope and courage and challenge and strength from various places, and that is okay. My own faith is an amalgamation of resources. I draw on Buddhist traditions and mindfulness for my spiritual practice and for a better understanding of my emotional life. But the wider worldview of Buddhism doesn't really resonate with me. Instead, My pictures of the sacred and my understanding of my neighbor are more Unitarian. A couple of weeks ago in a sermon, I rambled on about how Emerson describes the soul. That's because those ideas are helpful to me. And while I'm not a Christian, I don't believe that my salvation is tied into the person of Jesus. I do find incredible inspiration in that Christian message. The radical love of the person of Jesus, and the way the story about him offers the antithesis and the antidote to the evils of empire shakes me to my core. That radically inclusive, transformational love that says no to empire couldn't be more pertinent to our time. First and always, I've experienced the sacred in nature. Sometimes it's in that Wiccan pantheistic sense of the abundance of the sacred. Sometimes it's more in the self-reliance and simplicity of Thoreau and early Unitarians. This is not consistent. It is not a straight line. Nor is it lazy or a buffet religion that's a mile wide and an inch deep. This broad, sustaining faith is why, and perhaps because, I'm a Unitarian Universalist. There's room for all of it. As long as our beliefs point toward compassion, toward opening our hearts and our minds, there is room for all of it. All of the experience, learning, and inspiration that each person brings into this community. Last month, Tapestry's Racial Justice Task Force conducted a series of focus groups to better understand where we were in our considering of the eighth principle. The eighth principle would be a congregational commitment to dismantling racism and other forms of oppression, and to work really diligently toward building more multicultural, multiracial community here. Thank you to all of those who participated in the focus groups. It was really helpful to get a better sense of where we are as a congregation. And a fuller report of that will be coming out from the committee in January. We asked a lot of questions. One of the questions that seemed unanswered was, why would we want to build more diverse, more multicultural community? It is a really, really hard thing to do after all. One possible answer is that it's the popular thing to do in progressive circles. And we should recognize that just like every other human being, we're also impacted by what the cool kids are doing. We want to be on the right side of the issue, but peer pressure is not enough to keep that fire burning. A better answer to that question is that our faith calls us to engage increasingly diverse perspectives. Our history and our theology are about seeking truth alongside people who bring something different to the table. It's who we have claimed we are for a very long time. I think the best answer of why, though, is about seeking wholeness. Building multicultural, beloved community is a spiritual discipline reaching toward wholeness. I want to close this sermon about pluralism with a quote from African-American feminist Bell Hooks. She asked the question this way: what is all this clamoring after difference for? She says, all the clamoring is about seeking wholeness. Guilt leads to angry denial and inaction. Responsibility leads to grudging good works. The call to seek wholeness has room for acknowledging feelings of guilt, room for accepting appropriate responsibility, and plenty of room for moving toward personal and communal transformation. All the clamoring is for each person, each perspective, each truth to be granted sufficient respect so that we truly listen to those ideas and allow ourselves to be truly challenged by them. All the clamoring is for us to recognize that our lives are intertwined, so intertwined that each is accountable to the other. Each particular story calls us to accountability, calls me to accountability for my life, my limits, my individual and our collective transformation. All this clamoring is for truth. She writes, I need you. I need you, who you are, the experiences and perspective you bring, so that I may know the truth beyond my partial truth. All the clamoring is for justice. We need each other and what we can all do together for justice. Friends, this is our history, building stronger community and a better world in our different opinions, through our ability to authentically be different and love one another in the process. Amen.